Warning, this video contains speculation. If your imagination is broken or you lack one at all, please proceed with caution. Dark Souls is meant to be experienced by 1,000 different set of eyes and perspectives, and meant to create hundreds of stories from a single event. Thus, an open mind is entirely important when regarding the lore. Enjoy!
Hey, it's Jake the Ashen Hollow, and I hope you're all doing swell today. Are dark and chaos two sides to the same coin? And who was Velka? These are two questions we're going to be looking at strongly today. Think of this as a continuation of my last video about the prospect of Velka being the furtive pygmy. What? You didn't think that theory could get any deeper? Well, neither did I, and for the sake of this video, we're going to go off the basis that Velka is the furtive pygmy. If you still don't want to believe that, that's fine, but I urge you to continue watching. There is some very compelling evidence ahead, so let's jump right into it. Who was Velka? Let's take a look at this question first. We'll give it a brief answer, then delve into the evidence supporting it. Was she always Velka? Did she become Velka after she found the Dark Soul? I don't think she was always the goddess of sin, but perhaps her name could have still always been Velka, but she was predominantly identified by another moniker, the Witch of Izalith. Before I go any further, I need to address the common thought about the Witch of Izalith, and that is that she became the Bed of Chaos, but I simply don't believe that to be true. Let's read the description for the Lord Soul received from the Bed of Chaos. It reads, "Soul of the Bed of Chaos and the Mother of all demons. This Lord Soul was found at the dawn of the Age of Fire. The Witch of Izalith attempted to duplicate the first flame from a soul, but instead created a distorted being of chaos and fire. Its power formed a bed of life which would become the source of all demons and is more than enough to satiate the Lord Vessel." So what I really want to point out here is that it says when the witch attempted to duplicate the first flame, she instead created a distorted being of chaos and fire. Nowhere does it say she became a distorted being of chaos and fire. Now let's read a line from the Witch's Lock's whip, but more specifically, the weapon skill. It says, Witch's Locks, a whip fashioned from the black hair of a daughter of the Witch of Izalith, creator of the Flame of Chaos. Skill, Flame Whip. Temporarily coat the whip in fire. The self-same fire is that which consumed the witch herself, it is said. So there are two things here that really made me wonder. One is that when it comes to item descriptions in Dark Souls, we don't ever really see them casting doubt upon themselves. They're typically straightforward and to the point. But now, this weapon skill says, the same fire as which consumed the witch herself. It is said. It is said. You're the one saying it, Dark Souls. Shouldn't you know? To me, that casts doubt over the entire scenario. So let's even look at this sentence and just put "it is said" out of our minds for a moment. It says the fire consumed the witch, but that could mean multiple things. I don't believe fire to be a person, but more so a resource, in which case the definition for consume is to expend. Still, it says nothing of any kind of metamorphosis occurring with the Witch of Izalith. We know of two daughters who were distorted by the chaos, Quelaag and the Fair Lady, but we'll circle back around to them shortly, but not the witch herself. So let's explore what I think happened. We know that the witches had control over the Flame of Chaos for some time, long enough for the Witch of Izalith to even give birth to a child already distorted by chaos, ceaseless discharge. Though I do doubt that in the delivery room, when the Witch of Izalith first held her baby boy, she said, "Oh, my sweet baby boy, I will call him Ceaseless Discharge." No, his real name is probably Scott, or something like that. He looks like a Scott to me. Anyways, if we read the orange Charred ring, it says, "Since his sores were inflamed by lava from birth, his witch sisters gave him this special ring. But fool that he is, he readily dropped it, and from that spot a terrible centipede demon was born," giving us the indication that he was possibly conceived, but at least born, during the event of chaos, and not that the second the witch attempted to duplicate the first flame, that it just immediately exploded and all hell broke loose. Okay, so where could the witch have been when control of the chaos was finally too much to handle? If she was expent by the flame, as the definition would suggest, she could likely believe to be somewhere recovering, or on the brink of death itself, But something we need to address first is the question I'm sure many of you have, and that is, but how did the witch find the Dark Soul and her own Lord Soul at the Advent of Fire? Which is a great question. I don't believe that the Dark Soul was found anywhere near the Advent of Fire. The cinematic is a fairly peculiar thing. It simply states the holders of the 4 souls and doesn't mention where, how, or why they got them. Even as the narrator tells us who received the souls, the cinematic is showing us these characters in their prime, which I don't think is depicting when they found the souls. I highly doubt Gwen had an entire army of Silver Knights just hanging out with him looking for things in the fire. One thing I will quickly mention about the opening cinematic that struck me as curious as I was researching this theory is that after it lists the procurers of the Lord's souls, it immediately says, "With the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons." The keyword being they. If the Witch of Izalith would go on to become the Furtive Pygmy, then she certainly would still be considered in the description of they. It is commonly believed that the first Age of Fire was a golden age, meaning that it lasted a substantially long time, which I see no reason not to believe, especially considering that the Age of Fire that was extended to be at least around 1,000 years after Gwen linked the first flame. So there's a bit of dialogue from Koth that says, "After the Advent of Fire, the ancient lords found 3 souls, but your progenitor found a 4th, unique soul, the Dark Soul. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Soul and waited for fire to subside, and soon the flames did fade and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark." The question I have here is, how could the Pygmy possibly know that one day the fire would fade if it were at least 1,000 years in the past? I don't think that they would know. He goes on to say that, "And soon the flames did fade. Soon after the Dark Soul was found, the flames faded." Okay, that certainly could not have been at the Advent of Fire then. How could it be? When and why did the Witch of Izalith attempt to recreate the first flame? Why? Is because she shared the same concerns with Gwen and was looking for a way to extend the Age of Fire. So it seems incredibly safe to assume that she attempted this near the end of the Age of Fire. Why else would she risk so much? So the timeline here started coming together for me. Something we do know is that the Witch of Izalith is slightly larger than her daughters, which they are all human size, coincidentally enough. But in the cinematic, Gwen appears to be a lot taller than what we see him as when we fight him at the Kiln of the First Flame. Upon defeating him, we get what's left of his soul, which isn't much, but it is still powerful. That leads me to the assumption that to some degree, the strength of your soul can have an effect on your size, which is why I believe the witch was taller than her daughters, but she still didn't seem as if she was ever as tall as the others who found Lord Souls. So if she were to remove her soul and eventually lose it to the Bed of Chaos, I would think she'd be scaled back to size, which is likely the same human size as her daughters. So let's think for a second of what could happen with the witch if when losing control of the Flame of Chaos, she was able to get herself out, leaving behind the destruction of her home, the torment of her daughters, even the uncertainty of her daughters, and whether or not they thought she was dead. What then would a person with all that weight on their shoulders do? Well, let's take another look at the definition of furtive. Attempting to avoid notice or attention, typically due to a sense of guilt. That seems incredibly fitting to the Witch of Izalith. Another thing of the Pygmy we know is that they were forgotten. Another thing I believe denies Manus the title of Furtive Pygmy is the term forgotten. How could someone no one ever knew become forgotten? If the common thought was that the Witch of Izalith had become the Bed of Chaos when she hadn't, forgotten is the correct term. Even still, the name Witch of Izalith or the Bed of Chaos are both things that have been forgotten, except, of course, to those who were closely tied to her. So we know that the witch's attempt to recreate the first flame technically worked in a sense. It wasn't the first flame per se, but it was a flame in and of itself, which leaked power and spread life, in a similar manner to the first flame. So what if it were this new flame that produced the Dark Soul? Let's take a look at something really quick before we dive more into that question. In the opening cinematic, we get to see the Witch of Izalith holding her Lord Soul, just as we get to see the Pygmy. But is the Pygmy holding the Dark Soul in the cinematic? It doesn't look like the Dark Soul. If humanity are fragments of the Dark Soul, I think it's appropriate to believe that the Dark Soul is, well, dark. I mean, it is in the name. What the Pygmy is holding more resembles what the 3 other Lord Souls looked like. That's when I noticed this. Look at the hands of the Witch of Izalith, charred and burned. Likely so, she did have a lot to do with flame sorceries and creating pyromancy and such. Quelana wasn't the only mother of pyromancy, but I promise we'll get to that in a minute. Now look at the Pygmy's hands, charred and burned in the same manner as the witches. Then there's the soul. That can't be the Dark Soul. It looks like the very shattered remains of whatever was left of the Witch of Izalith's original soul. The rest we know became the bed of chaos. So, an unanswered question that has always been out there is, who fathered the witch's daughters and was likely her husband? I personally would like to get Manus on the Maury show and see if we can get a paternity test going. But Manus absolutely does have a lot to do with the Dark Soul. There isn't really any denying that. If the Witch of Izalith found the Dark Soul, it wouldn't be too far off to think she gave some to her husband before spreading it to the humans. We know humans are labeled as greedy and evil, as per Kieran and Goff, which, might I add, are demonic qualities as well, hint hint. Anyways, it is likely Manus became greedy and wanted more and more of the Dark Soul until the witch had had enough. So let's look into some mythology that I think could have inspired this story in the Dark Souls universe. One term from ancient Egypt is Izalith, which means chaos. So I just want you to hold on to that for a moment while we dive into the mythology of Lilith. It mostly iterates from Kabbalism, and in Hebrew, Lilith translates roughly to night creature or night bird. Night bird. Oh snap. Can you see where I might be headed? So, in this tale, Lilith was actually the first woman, even before Eve, and was the first wife to Adam. There are several different tales, but they mostly circle around the same underlying theme. So obviously I won't sit here for hours and tell you every single one of them. We'll just do a broad outline. One story goes that Lilith was created in the manner that she was contained inside of Adam, and that her soul was lodged in the great abyss. When God called Lilith, she came forth and joined with Adam, but thousands of evil spirits followed her from the abyss and tried to attach themselves to Adam, but God drove them away, leaving Adam temporarily soulless. After some time, Adam and Lilith disagreed on things. Adam expected her to submit to him, as was his right as a man to be the figurehead, but Lilith refused to submit, suggesting that since they were made from the same clay, that they should be equal. Eventually, Lilith sprouted black wings and flew away to live by the Red Sea, where it is said that she birthed 100 demons daily, as was known forward as the mother of demons. Another story speaks of Lilith and her young fearfully destroying their own home out of fear after Gilgamesh killed the serpent in the garden. Lastly, there is a parable that speaks about Lilith, which says, "Her house sinks down to death, and her course leads to the shades." Now these tales sound very similar to the story of the Witch of Izalith. Now you didn't forget that word I wanted you to remember, did you? Izalith, which means chaos. So I was thinking, what could Izalith and Lilith have to do with each other? Yeah, they both can be related to the story of the Witch of Izalith individually for sure, but do they mean anything together? Okay, so just so we can say we tried, let's put the two words together, Izalith and Lilith, and see what we get. So Izalith plus Lilith equals Izalith. I guess it's nothing. Ha! Psych! I didn't miss it, did you? That sounds a shite ton like Izalith. Wow, that's pretty neato. Alright, so now let's talk about some of the things in these tales. So of course the first thing is Lilith, meaning Nightbird. Night in Dark Souls is often actually referencing the dark, like Vrarier Nox means I fear the night, which I think it would be silly to assume that Gwyn in the Way of White can't sleep without their nightlights on, but rather night would mean dark. So if we think of it as Darkbird, what is it that you picture in reference to Dark Souls? I picture a blackbird. Now it's starting to sound a lot like Velka. Cool, so now we have some of this imagery coming into place. The reference of Lilith and her young fearfully destroying their home can easily be symbolic to the Witch of Izalith and her daughters, out of fear of the dark, attempting to recreate the first flame, but fail, resulting in the destruction of their home. Mother of Demons definitely makes sense, since the witch did create the flame of chaos that produced all the demons. So the story of Adam and Lilith is where I'd like to reference Manus again, to go with my theory of him being the husband and getting greedy for more power from the Dark Soul. The word Manus in Latin means hand. I think that has been brought up a lot in the Dark Souls community, but in Roman it also means legal power of a man over his wife. In the story of Lilith, she disagrees with Adam's claims that he should have power over her and eventually turns away from him and leaves. The same could be similar here with Manus and the Witch of Izalith. Once I discovered that, I thought it would be silly just to name a creature Manus, which means hand, just because he has a big hand. I'm definitely not saying that isn't one of the reasons, but this could be a big one too, especially looking at the mythology that we know Dark Souls uses all kinds of as inspiration for the game. Now I want to look at 3 images. See if you can point out the similarities in them, and whether or not you believe it to just be a coincidence of some sort, or perhaps something more important. I would also like to point out that the only 2 catalysts that can be used as effective striking weapons are Manus' catalyst and the demon catalyst. Again, coincidence or something else. So when we look at the Sable Church of Londor, we know at this point is heavily influenced by Velka. The common thought is that the founders, Yuria and her 2 sisters, are daughters of Velka. It definitely makes a lot of sense, especially considering if we believe Eleonora to be referencing them as relatives of the Oracle being a shard of Manus, which would definitely make them oddly related. The reason I want to quickly point this out is that these sisters and Velka's daughters are the same size as humans. They are pygmies just like us. So that means there are only 2 deities that we know of that are producing human-sized offspring, Velka and the Witch of Izalith. How curious. So now I want to take a pit stop over in Dark Souls 2. There is a way to receive fragments of the 3 original Lord Souls found in the First Flame by fighting certain bosses in New Game Plus. We can get the remnants of Gwyn's, Nito's, Seath's, and the Old Witch's Soul. No Manus in there, huh? Not the Pygmy confirmed. I'm just kidding. You guys know I don't like the whole confirmed thing. So in order to get a remnant of the Witch of Izalith's soul, which is just referred to as the Old Witch's soul, by the way, which I thought was curious, because presumably the Old Witches we know are the same 2 that keep interlooping with each other, Velka and the Witch of Izalith. Anyways, so to get this soul, we fight a boss called the Lost Sinner. When I was researching this theory, I actually chuckled out loud when I saw this, thinking of different things that could tie Velka and the Witch of Izalith to being the same thing. Then there's this boss called the Lost Sinner. I'm hoping you can see my amusement. Everything we know about sin in Dark Souls derives from Velka, so that connection isn't too hard off to make off the bat. The fight with the Lost Sinner is fought in a very dark room. Not the Abyss, obviously, but perhaps it's meant to be symbolic of it. When her health reaches a certain point, 2 dark phantom pyromancers appear to fight alongside her, again, fitting of the Witch of Izalith. The Lost Sinner, by the way, in the original translation is actually called the Forgotten Sinner. Just thought that was cool because, well, you know, the pygmy and what have you, forgotten as well. So I'm not saying the Lost Sinner is the Witch of Izalith or is Velka or anything. I think it's supposed to just be symbolic of the person and the events, something to give us clues, if you will. When talking about the first sin, it is often referred to as Gwyn linking the first flame, which made sense. I had always thought that as well. But what if it wasn't? What if the Witch of Izalith committed the first sin when she attempted to duplicate the first flame? That is kind of like creating a false idol or something along those lines. It would be considered very heretical and a sin indeed. I'm beginning to subscribe to that notion. So the soul of the Lost Sinner says, the Lost Sinner eternally punishes herself for the sins of her past. The sins of the Witch of Izalith's past are certainly well known. To me, it seems poetic that the goddess of sin would become the goddess of sin as part of her atonement for her own sins. That seems to speak on such a profound level that Dark Souls is known to place their story upon. From the Lost Sinner's soul, we can create the Lost Sinner's sword, which reads, an ultra great sword forged from the soul of the Lost Sinner. Its blade saps the life of its wielder. The true nature of the sword is unknown, even to the lost sinner herself. Those who choose the sword will share the burden of the lost sinner's misdeeds. So there are a couple things here. First, I will mention that while not in the exact same way, it is slightly similar to how Life Hunt, the power of Priscilla, works. It inflicts damage upon its wielder, but in the case of Life Hunt's scythe, it first builds up its bleed and then inflicts the damage. The Lost Sinner's sword, however, just inflicts flat damage upon its wielder. Very much so, exactly like the Chaos Blade, which is also born from the soul of Quelaag, daughter of Chaos in Dark Souls 1, and from the Old Witch soul in 2. So before we dive into the Chaos Blade, let me wrap up talking about the Lost Sinner. Another curious thing about the Sinner's sword is that it scales negatively with your sin meter in game. So for example, the more you sin you have acquired, the less damage the sword does, which is yet just another thing that is so quintessentially Velka. So if we read the Old Witch soul, it says, "Soul of the Ineffable. This once magnificent soul continues to exert influence over the land even after the eons have reduced it to these remnants. Use it to acquire numerous souls or to create something of great worth." The word ineffable is what stood out to me. Now there are two meanings ineffable could have here. One means too great or extreme to be expressed in words, the other means not to be uttered, which can be either because of religious or sacrilegious reasons. So I don't believe the first definition is what is being described here. For one, it says the soul of the ineffable, not speaking of the soul itself, but of the Witch of Izalith. Then it says this once magnificent soul. So it really couldn't be speaking about the soul. It wouldn't make sense. Plus, it goes on to say that the soul was once magnificent, indicating that it might not be so much anymore. Anyways, the fact that the Witch of Izalith is ineffable and is portrayed through the lost or forgotten sinner here screams to me that we should be seriously considering the witch's actions to be the first sin, which again would be so beautifully poetic and so Dark Souls-esque for the goddess of sin herself to have committed the first sin. So there are a couple things I mentioned I promised I would return to, so let's explore those. So since Dark Souls 1, the common thought has been that Quelana was the creator and mother of pyromancy. But now that Dark Souls 3 has released, we can see a few items that provide insight to quite the contrary. The Witch's Ring says, "The Witch of Izalith and her daughters, scorched by the flame of chaos, taught humans the art of pyromancy and offered them this ring. Every pyromancer is familiar with the parable that tells of the witches espousing the need to fear the flame and teaching the art of pyromancy to men in hopes that they might learn to control it." So we learn a couple of interesting things here. So when the flame of chaos appeared, so did pyromancy, it seems. I don't know if from controlling the flame for the time they did gave the witches more insight on how to manipulate fire or how exactly it came to be, but that isn't super relevant either way. But the ring says that the Witch of Izalith and her daughters taught the humans the art of pyromancy, so in a sense they were all pyromancers, or at least knew how to use pyromancies. It is also very curious that they only taught humans the art of pyromancy. What relationship do they have with the humans? So we know the Dark Soul is eventually spread amongst humanity, giving them all their, well, humanity, but they were still alive before then. Not sure whether or not they were still called humans before receiving the Dark Soul, but that doesn't really matter. We're still just going to say they're humans as to avoid confusion. So, humans are descendants from the Dark Soul, and humans are literally just pygmies themselves of the race that we see in Dark Souls. Gwyn and his following and everyone else all much larger, but still part of the same race as humans, since we know pygmy just means a shorter group of people in an ethnic group. So it makes sense that if a pygmy procured the Dark Soul, all of their descendants would likely be pygmies as well, or humans rather. Potato potato. So it started to make more sense to me when I looked back at the thought of the Witch of Izalith and Manus being the first humans, and all of their descendants being humans as well. Like I said before, the only deities we see that have human-sized offspring are the Witch of Izalith and Velka. These coincidences are just happening too frequently to not give this theory some serious thought. So then it would make sense for the Witch of Izalith to spread the Dark Soul she acquired to her people. So I went on a slight rabbit trail there, I admit, because you're likely saying, well, that's good and all, but the witches all teaching humans pyromancy doesn't mean Quelana wasn't the sole mother of pyromancy, which is a valid thought. So let me read the white hair talisman, which says, talisman made from a lock of white hair. This lock of hair belonged to a deformed member of the Chaos Witches, mothers of the art of pyromancy. Fashioned into a talisman, it enables the wielder to cast both miracles and pyromancies. The white hair being a shout out to the fair lady, obviously, but this talisman mentions the Chaos Witches as mothers, plural, mothers of the art of pyromancy. So I felt that it was important to kind of cast a little shade towards Quelana. We know she abandoned Izalith when things started to get bad. She admits that to us. She also says she is feigning ablution. Ablution is the act of cleaning oneself. Likely she meant it as a way of her redemption for abandoning her family, but she still admits to feigning it. So it doesn't really mean anything to her. So what I'm getting at is that Quelana isn't a horrible person or anything, though there is an interesting video about the demons in Izalith by a YouTuber by the name of Hawkshaw, who thinks that Quelana is actually a very manipulative liar herself. Now, I don't necessarily mold my story to the theory of this video, but you guys know me well enough to know that I never consider any one theory to be fact, and I love the telling of all stories. So feel free to check their video out after mine, of course. I'll leave a link in the description. I just think that Quelana is misguided. She tells you that all of her sisters and her mother were transformed into terrible beasts, which we know simply is not true. Quelaag and the Fair Lady, yes, sure, it happened to them. But there is the eldest daughter we fight outside the bed of Chaos Boss Room, and she seems perfectly unchanged to me. Then there's the hot topic of debate about the corpse by ceaseless discharge, whether it's supposed to be Quelana or not. Assuming it is one of the unaccounted for daughters, well, this corpse appears to be unchanged as well. Then there are two more sisters, commonly thought to be the orbs we see on either side of the bed of chaos, which, despite my past belief, actually makes sense now. We can see Izalith's stabs coming out from these orbs. Thanks again, Hawkshaw. But these things are just orbs of light. I don't think that falls under the category of deformed beast. I think actually these two sisters made the choice to become what they became. These two orbs are still attempting to control the chaos. And as we can see, each time one of them is broke, the bed of chaos becomes more rampant and wild. Another thing we have seen throughout Dark Souls is that all Firekeepers are humans, which I mean makes perfect sense. Their souls are infinite draws for humanity, or the Dark Soul, so that was pretty easy to put together. Is a Firekeeper a chosen profession though? Or are the Firekeepers chosen to fulfill the role? I'd likely believe that is a choice. As we see in Dark Souls 3, Irina is a young girl who failed to become a Firekeeper, yet the humanity is still gnawing away at her soul. So my guess is that is a ritual of some sort, and she failed or whatever. But if we follow her storyline, she can become one. But I digress. So if all Firekeepers are humans and directly related to the Dark Soul, then I want to bring up the Fair Lady again. Because she's a frickin' Firekeeper, isn't she? Put another loaf of bread in the basket for Chaos Witches being directly tied to humanity. Also, I have absolutely no idea if that's a real saying, but I like bread and I like baskets, so we're sticking with it. Okay, so let's read the soul we get from the Fair Lady. Soul of a Daughter of Chaos, Firekeeper of Quelaag's domain. A Firekeeper's soul is a draw for humanity, and held within their bosoms below just a thin layer of skin are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm. To her, the countless eggs which appeared were cradles for each tiny humanity. So not only is she a draw for humanity and has swarms of it beneath her skin, all of her eggs are cradling humanity as well. She's like a super Firekeeper or something. Perhaps it is because of the strong ties humanity could have to chaos, but a Daughter of Chaos being a Firekeeper is incredibly important. It seems more and more likely that the Witch of Izalith and her daughters are indeed human, and probably the biggest factor in the growing race of humans. So let me try to further connect the Witch of Izalith and Velka, though we already have a fair bit of evidence that could suggest they are one and the same. But it's always wise to dig deeper. So let's read the description for Velka's own miracle, Vow of Silence. Secret rite of black-haired witch Velka prevents casting of magic within effect area. Velka, the goddess of sin, is a rogue deity, but she is versed in arts both new and old, and is considered to have a great range of influence even as gods are concerned. Versed in both arts new and old sounds like something someone who has been around a long time would be well versed in, especially if we consider that someone was someone who procured one of the 3 Lord Souls from within the first flame. Then there is new arts, which could imply the power that came with the Dark Soul. Seems at least like a fair assumption to me. Also, it's considered to have a great range of influence even as the gods are concerned. Where does this influence come from? How could a self-proclaimed deity command so much influence? To me, it seems probable that this influence comes from spreading her soul amongst humanity. That is certainly one way to get it done. Next, let's talk about the Crow demons. If we reference the Lord Soul found on the bed of chaos again, it mentions that it became the source of all demons. I don't think that necessarily means that it created all the demons that would exist in one fell explosion. I think rather that is where the demons get their strength and is where they're born from. So it doesn't seem crazy to me to think that the witch could still dip into the flame of chaos for its power. It is the source of all demons, and in the painted world, which we cannot dispute in one form or another belongs to Velka, we find these crow demons. A crow, because we know that has become the symbol of Velka. Also, don't forget Lilith, translate to Nightbird, by the way, and that these crows happen to be demons. You guys have heard my saying before that coincidences just don't happen in Dark Souls, and even if they did, they wouldn't happen over and over again when we're considering a single possibility. In Lost Izalith, we find a commonly seen and quite irritating enemy, unless of course you are the just run past everything kind of guy, called Bounding Demons of Izalith, aka Dragon Butts. Yes, we've all had these dragon butts try to sit their fat cabooses on us before. Now, I don't know if that means that some dragons were demons. I doubt that. I think it is more likely that some of the dragon corpses were distorted into demons. Either way, there is only one other place to find a dragon butt in the game. Would you like to guess where? Nope. It's not twerking down in the catacombs. Nor is it working the corners of Anor Londo. It's hanging out right here in the painted world. Imagine that. No, don't imagine the twerking dragon butts. Imagine the sense of sarcastic shock I experienced to find yet another one of these coincidences. So, I feel like I've done a decent job at digging up this evidence that could convince you that Velka is actually the Witch of Izalith, or vice versa, and that she was the founder of the Dark Soul. Now let's look at some things that will not only further this case, but point out how similar Chaos and Dark are to each other, and how they even seem to feed off of each other. So let's read both Quelaag's Fury Sword and the Chaos Flame Ember. Quelaag's Fury Sword says, "A curved sword born from the soul of Quelaag, daughter of the Witch of Izalith, who was transformed into a Chaos Demon. Like Quelaag's body, the sword features shells, spikes, and a coating of Chaos Fire, power affected by wielder's humanity." And Chaos Flame Ember says, "Ember required for weapon ascension. Chaos Flame Ember is an art of the lost city of Izalith, handled only by blacksmith knowledgeable in ancient methods. Ascends +5 fire weapon to Chaos weapon. Chaos weapons are demon weapons augmented by humanity, which inflict fire damage." Do you see the similarities in these two items? They both state that the power of chaos infused into weapons scales with the amount of humanity its wielder possesses. To me, that simple fact alone is enough to say, yeah, chaos and dark are definitely connected, end of story. Why else would the power of chaos grow with the strength of dark? Same coin, two sides. Of course, you know me well enough to know I won't stop at a single example. There is another unique weapon that is not infused with chaos that we should read, and that is the Abyss Greatsword. And it says, "This greatsword belonged to Lord Gwyn's knight Artorius, who fell to the Abyss. Swallowed by the dark with its master, this sword is tainted by the Abyss, and now its strength reflects its wielder's humanity." So this Abyss-tainted sword scales with the wielder's humanity as well. How about that? Chaos and the Abyss, or Dark, can make a weapon scale with humanity. Let's consider the weapon infusions in Dark Souls 3. The Chaos Gem and the Dark Gems infuse their respective properties onto the weapons, and they are the only two that make their weapons damage scale with both intelligence and faith. That isn't something that is outstanding proof, obviously, but it's curious still. Dark and Chaos scaling with intelligence and faith was kind of weird to me at first, but came to making sense. Dark, as we know, was formerly called Occult, which was the infusion of Velka, so faith makes sense as she was a goddess, and the intelligence because we know her talisman scaled off of intelligence, which didn't quite make too much sense to me. I had just assumed that it was because she was a witch, but we know the Witch of Izalith was a very knowledgeable sorcerer, more so than she was with miracles, so it would make sense that her talisman scales with her more competent trait. Thus we find Chaos and Dark infusions mirroring each other. Next, I will read the Izalith Staff. It says, ancient catalyst of the Witch of Izalith and her daughters used long before the dawn of chaos and of pyromancy. With the birth of the Chaos Flame, the Flame Witches were at once both sorcerers and shamans. Faith adjusts the power of sorceries cast using this catalyst, and the staff also seems to boost the power of dark sorceries. So first off, I tried digging into shamanism for more answers, and this is mostly what I learned. A shaman is a person regarded as having access to and influence in the world of benevolent and malevolent spirits, who typically enter into a trance state during a ritual and practices divination and healing. So I'm not really sure what that could mean in this situation. Perhaps the idea of both malevolent and benevolent spirits could indicate another two-sided coin concept. Again, I'm not entirely sure. But what is important about the description for this staff is that with the birth of chaos, the staff boosted the power of dark sorceries. That is incredibly interesting, especially when entertaining the idea that the dark soul came from within the chaos flame. That would begin to start make a lot of sense. Why in the world else would the birth of chaos make the Izalith staff boost the strength of dark sorceries? It is absurd to think it coincidence at this point. So let's also consider the fact that in Dark Souls 1, the only two covenants to bolster your reputation with humanity is with the Dark Wraiths and the Servants of Chaos. Yes, we know we are feeding the fair lady humanity to stave off her sickness, which we can assume derived from the blight pus that Ingji said she swallowed in order to save him and the other presumable outcasts, but that is besides the point, as I believe the humanities are going directly to nourished eggs and don't really have anything to do with why she is a firekeeper, but is still curious nonetheless. On the topic of Ingyi, let me bring up a few curiosities I find involving him. We know that he is very loyal and devoted follower of the Fair Lady, so it isn't too hard to tie him to chaos. We know Ingyi was a pyromancer and authored several pyromancies himself, two of which are Poison and Toxic Mist, but we need only read one. Unique pyromancy crafted by Ingyi, considered a heretic even at the Great Swamp. Create intense poison mist. Why was Ingyi driven from the Great Swamp? One only need cast this pyromancy, a perverse diversion from the art of fire, to find out. So Ingyi was cast out from the Great Swamp and eventually would find his way to the Fair Lady. Also, an interesting point is that we see other hollows infected with eggs, not in the same manner as we see Ingyi and the other egg bearers, but in a different manner. What is curious though is that these egg-bearing hollows also use poison and toxic mist pyromancies, and they are located where else but the Painted World. So in the Painted World, we can also find a pyromancy called Acid Surge, and it says, pyromancy foreign to the Great Swamp, emit acid which corrodes weapons and armor. Not all pyromancy originates in the Great Swamp. One hears rumors of unknown pyromancers inhabiting various lands, and this spell is the work of one such outlander. Now I think this might also be the work of Ingyi. It definitely has the characteristics of his other pyromancies, and when speaking to him of when he found the Fair Lady, he says, "Worse than undead, we are diseased and unwanted, like the grime of the Great Swamp, but my dear Fair Lady, she cried for me, and swallowed the great blight pus despite Mistress Quaylag's orders to the contrary." So there were several people with Ingyi, and in Acid Surge it talks about pyromancers inhabiting different lands. Then one of them went on to create Acid Surge itself. My assumption is that the pyromancers this talks about are the ones traveling with Ingyi, and that he was the one who went to write Acid Surge. But why is this important, you ask? Well, what does he say? Worse than undead, we are diseased and unwanted. And where is the best place for unwanted souls? The Painted World. So I think it is likely the hollows shooting poisons at us there are part of the group Ingyi was with, but some no doubt stayed behind to help the fair lady, which just seems to connect all too well with the Witch of Izalith being Velka, because how else are all these things related just ending up in the Painted World? Okay, so we're getting close to being done. Just keep hanging in there with me. I believe in you. But let's talk about Chaos Blade now. In Dark Souls 1, it is a weapon we can create with Quelaag's soul. And the Chaos Blade description reads, a curved sword born from the soul of Quelaag, daughter of the Witch of Izalith, who was transformed into a chaos demon. This blade inherits only the chaotic nature of Quelaag and has a unique speckled design. Blade wielder erodes along with opponents. I mentioned before that the art of a weapon sapping life from its wielder is a common trait between the Chaos Blade and the Life Hunt Scythe, which normally I would have shrugged off, but as we're delving into this specific theory, I thought it was tremendously curious. So let's look at some curiosities I found with the Chaos Blade and the Life Hunt Scythe. So, the Chaos Blade pops up in all 3 Dark Souls games. In 1, we get it from Quelaag's soul, in 2, we get it from the old witch soul, and in 3, we find it in the untended graves where the Swordmaster is known to be hanging out at our Firelink Shrine. Which is curious, I just don't have any info on that for now. There is also 2 people we know who can go completely invisible without the risk of dissipation, which the hidden body sorcery says is the reason complete invisibility is unachievable. And those 2 people are Quaelana and Priscilla. Although that isn't much to go on and doesn't quite link the 2 together, these are just small things to stack together towards the case of this isn't coincidence anymore. Now I'm going to do something I don't normally do, and in fact I haven't done it yet, and that is to make reference to cut content. I know that cut content is not very reliable at all, since it was cut after all, but this is still pretty interesting, and could point in the direction that the story was going with, even if it was cut. So what was cut was some extra dialogue from Shiva of the East, and a small ad onto his questline. Basically, he says to you, have you heard of the Chaos Blade, the legendary sword of the ancient undead master Makoto? Which is interesting given the fact that we get the blade from the soul of a daughter of chaos, and it could have also been the blade from specifically an undead. Then in the game, once you get the sword and talk to Shiva again, he will kill you, take the sword and run away. Then you would receive another black eye orb to invade the guilty and take your sword back, and the most curious part was that we found him in the Painted World. Now again, it is just cut content, but it is still curious. But the description of the Chaos Blade in Dark Souls 3 reads, a cursed sword of unknown origin bearing uncanny streaks on its blade. Attacks also damage its wielder. The sword is not unlike a thing misshapen, granted life, but never welcome in this world. In other words, chaos itself. And when I think never welcomed into this world, I just immediately think of something belonging to the Painted World. So just take that with a grain of salt. It could mean something, it could not, especially considering I've paired it with cut content. I just wanted you guys to consider all the things I've been considering. So before we wrap this up here, let me just present you with a few other things I found peculiar about this theory that I couldn't find a place for in the script without going down a bunch of different rabbit trails and losing everyone in confusion. First is the Pyromancy Chaos Bed Vestiges. It reads, traces of the tumultuous seedbed that birthed the beings known as demons. Demons born from fire bore its smoldering essence and perished soon after. Man shares the same report with the flames to this day. So it says man shares this same report with flames. The flames representing the chaos flames, obviously, because it is what the description is talking about. Report means a close and harmonious relationship. So man shares a close and harmonious relationship with the chaos flames. Well, if that just ain't a kick in the pants, how about them apples? Now, if we look at the effigy shield, which reads, frightful occult shield defends against divine weapons and lightning. In an ill-fated plot to destroy the very gods, the followers of the occult once attempted to steal the power of the Grave Lord Nito, the first of the dead. The occult, we know, belongs to Velka, so that makes sense if you watched my other video about Velka being the furtive pygmy, that she went to war with the gods. But what does effigy mean? Well, it means a sculpture or model of someone. So now if we look at the effigy shield, that looks like a demon of some sort to me. It isn't something we've seen before, but definitely very demonic looking, no doubt. Which, if tied to the occult and Velka, with the Witch of Izalith being the mother to demons, just kinds of links these two together quite nicely. Also, does Manus's legs seem a little feathery to you? I mean, I don't think they look exactly like feathers, but very feather-esque. Black feathers to be precise. Plus, on top of that, his legs and feet look very bird-like to me. Could he be a demon of sorts, related to Chaos and Dark? We know there to be Chaos demons, but not really Dark demons. But if he was the Witch of Izalith's husband and contained a large lump of humanity, his distortion from the Flame of Chaos could be unique. Just something else to think about. So we know whips are a very common weapon for pyromancers. King Jeremiah wields a whip. We even have a whip made out of Chaos Witch hair, and we don't see anyone else using whips. Heck, they even created a pyromancy that is just a whip made out of flames. So I found it curious that you could also use a +10 whip to make the Life Hunt Scythe in Dark Souls 1. Just food for thought though. Speaking of witch hair, have you noticed the only things made of hair in Dark Souls are Velka's talisman, the white hair talisman, and the witch's locks? Seems curious that two of these things are only from confirmed Chaos Witches, and the Velka's talisman is from a person I truly believe is the Witch of Izalith. Curiouser and curiouser. Then there is the bond between pyromancers and their pupils. In Dark Souls, we can give certain covenants our humanity and thus strengthen the bond with it. We are literally giving a piece of ourselves to form a bond. In the same way that Laurentius, our favorite Australian pyromancer in Dark Souls 1, says he gave us a piece of himself when he gave us our flame. These two things seem similar of each other. Also, Cornyx, the pyromancer from Dark Souls 3, calls himself the Old Crow. Crow, right? Pretty interesting. Then there is the Dark Sign itself, which is depicted as being made with fire. Plus, the undead can use the Dark Sign as a homeward bone of sorts to return to their bonfire, but at the cost of all of their souls and humanity. Which seems kind of symbolic of Izalith. Sacrifice everything to go back or start again? Also, in Dark Souls 1, in trading with the crows, we can get a ring of sacrifice and a rare ring of sacrifice by giving them a humanity and a twin humanity respectively. So that is at least another hint towards Velka's connection to the Dark Soul. So to sum this theory up, I believe the Witch of Izalith to be the furtive pygmy and Velka. Whether her actual name was Velka beforehand or not, she has been known by 3 different titles: the Witch of Izalith, the furtive pygmy, and the Goddess of Sin. In all the actions the Witch of Izalith committed, the testimony that Velka is a rogue deity strikes me exactly as what the witch would be, along with furtive. That, along with all the evidence I provided, just makes too much sense to me. Though, you are allowed to disagree. We are, after all, writing our own stories. But I enjoy sharing my findings and my story with you guys. I look forward to seeing what you guys think of this theory. This has been the one I've worked on the longest, probably. About a month, I would say. And of course, I've got to give another shout out to my friend Leo, who helped me collect my thoughts and make sense of the things and the many conversations we've had. So, if you liked this video, please remember to give it a like. It's only natural, sillyhead. And if you haven't subscribed, I hope that you will. And remember to be respectful of everyone in the comments, not just to me, but to other people who are voicing their opinions and thoughts as well. We do not need to sow anger between each other. We're all on the same team. It's too easy to cheerfully disagree with someone. So thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll catch you next time. Also, I wanted to throw a couple things out there to you guys. I have a community Discord set up now, and it's open to anyone and everyone who wants to join. I'll put a link for that in the description. It's a great place to come and chat with the other assholes, and I would love to see you guys in there communicating with each other. And I'm in there quite often as well, so if you ever wanted to hang out and talk to me, there's the best place to do it. Also, if you've ever considered supporting the channel further, Patreon is the best place to do it. It helps me tremendously with being able to put more time and effort into my work for you guys, and it also helps me get my content out much quicker. So consider that if you've ever thought of supporting this channel further. And of course, to those of you that are already patrons, thank you from the bottom of my ashy heart. And don't forget to follow me on Twitch as well. I've got a weekly streaming schedule set up now, and I'd love to see some new faces in our chat and the PvP fight clubs. And of course, for all updates, follow me on Twitter at The Ashen Hollow. Thanks so much, everyone. Peace, I'm out.